The moment I realized my marriage was ending, nobody slammed a door, nobody raised their voice, and nobody said goodbye. It happened in complete silence, hidden behind a half-open library door on a rainy Thursday night. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of Villa Belladonna, turning Lake Co into a sheet of black glass beneath the storm clouds. The old stone hall seemed colder than usual as I walked barefoot across the marble floor, one hand wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea that had already gone lukewarm. It was almost 11 o'clock. Vincent still hadn't come upstairs. That wasn't unusual anymore. Lately, my husband spent more time inside his library than anywhere else in the villa. More time with business calls, reports, and responsibilities than with me. I told myself I understood. I always told myself I understood. Loving a man like Vincent Romano meant accepting that part of him belonged to a world I could never fully enter. But understanding something doesn't stop it from hurting. The library light glowed beneath the door at the end of the hallway. I smiled faintly as I approached. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe he'd finally take a break. Maybe we'd sit by the fireplace like we used to, and talk about something other than schedules and obligations. Maybe I'd hear him laugh again. I missed his laugh more than I wanted to admit. As I reached for the brass handle, I heard another voice inside. Matteo, Vincent's oldest friend. I paused automatically. Their conversation sounded serious. I should have walked away. Instead, I stood there, not because I wanted to listen. As I heard my name, Matteo asked quietly how much longer Vincent was going to keep pretending everything was fine. Silence followed. Then Vincent sighed. It wasn't an angry sigh. It sounded tired, older somehow. I don't know, he said. My fingers tightened around the mug. You love her. Matteo sounded almost frustrated. Another pause. Then Vincent answered. That's not the problem. Something inside my chest tightened. Rain tapped harder against the windows. I could hear it even through the thick wooden door. Matteo lowered his voice. Then what is? I don't think I've ever forgotten a single word that came next. I don't think I ever will. Vincent laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. Evelyn loves the memories more than the reality. My heart stopped. The tea trembled inside the cup. What does that mean? Matteo asked. Vincent was quiet for several seconds. Long enough for me to wish he wouldn't answer. Long enough for me to leave, but I couldn't move. She loves the man I used to be, he finally said. The version of me from 10 years ago. The man who had time. The man who made promises. The man who believed he could balance everything. His voice dropped lower and colder. But that man doesn't exist anymore. I stared at the door. My reflection stared back from the polished brass handle, and sometimes, Vincent continued, I think she loves those memories more than she loves me. The world blurred. Not because I was crying, not yet. Because suddenly every lonely dinner, every missed anniversary, every conversation that ended too soon rushed back at once. He thought that was what I felt. He thought I loved a memory. He thought I was holding on to a ghost. The truth was so much simpler. I didn't miss who Vincent used to be. I missed being part of his life. I missed feeling chosen. I missed feeling seen. My wedding ring slipped against my finger as my hand shook. Before I could stop it, the ring slid free and struck the marble floor with a tiny metallic sound that echoed through the hallway. Inside the library, the conversation stopped immediately, and for the first time in 10 years of marriage, I didn't pick the ring back up. I didn't sleep that night. The storm lingered over Lake Co until dawn, wrapping Villa Belladonna in wind and rain that rattled the old windows and whispered through the stone walls. I sat alone beside the bedroom fireplace with a blanket around my shoulders. I stared at the wedding ring resting on the small table beside me. Vincent had knocked on the bedroom door twice after midnight. The first time I pretended to be asleep. The second time, I heard him hesitate outside before walking away. Neither of us mentioned what happened in the hallway. Neither of us knew how. Morning arrived gray and cold. The lake beyond the balcony looked almost silver beneath the clouds. I stood in front of the closet for several minutes before choosing a sweater Vincent once said was his favorite. Then I folded it back onto the shelf and picked another one. The decision felt ridiculous, but somehow it hurt. By breakfast, the villa was awake. Staff moved quietly through the hallways. Fresh coffee filled the dining room. Vincent was already seated at the long oak table when I entered. He looked up immediately. For a second, something flickered across his face. Concern maybe. Guilt. but it disappeared before I could be certain. "Good morning," he said. I nodded and said good morning back. A servant poured coffee into my cup. The silence between us felt heavier than the rain clouds outside. Vincent opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something else. Then his phone vibrated. He glanced down. The moment vanished. "I have meetings most of the afternoon," he said. "I might be late for dinner." Of course he would. I stirred my coffee without drinking it. "That's fine." He studied me for a second longer. "Are you sure?" I almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because I couldn't remember the last time he asked that question. "Yes," I said softly. "I'm sure." He nodded and returned his attention to the screen in front of him. That was it. 10 years of marriage reduced to coffee growing cold between us. Later that afternoon, I wandered into the rose garden behind the villa. The rain had finally stopped, leaving tiny droplets clinging to the red and white blooms. This had once been my favorite place. Vincent used to meet me here after work. We'd sit on the stone bench overlooking the lake and talk for hours. Back when neither of us had to schedule conversations. I ran my fingers across a rose petal and realized something uncomfortable. I had spent years waiting. Waiting for business trips to end. Waiting for meetings to finish. Waiting for him to come upstairs. Waiting for him to notice I was lonely. Waiting had become a habit. The thought stayed with me all afternoon. That evening, I found myself standing in front of a locked cabinet in the upstairs sitting room. Inside was a collection of old journals I had kept throughout our marriage. Hundreds of pages, thousands of moments. The first journal dated back to our honeymoon. The last one was only half full. I unlocked the cabinet and carried the newest journal to the window overlooking the lake. The cover felt worn beneath my fingertips. I opened to a random page. My own handwriting stared back at me. Every line carried the same quiet hope. Every page told the story of someone trying to save something that was slowly slipping away. And for the first time, I wondered what Vincent would think if he ever read any of it. The journal remained open on my lap long after the afternoon light faded from the lake. Outside the window, the water reflected streaks of gold and gray as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. But I barely noticed. I was reading a version of myself I had almost forgotten. Page after page carried the small details of a life I had tried so hard to protect. The first entry I stopped on was dated 7 years earlier. Vincent and I had been married for only 3 years. I smiled despite myself as I read the words. Vincent surprised me with breakfast on the terrace this morning. Burned toast. Terrible coffee. He looked proud of himself. I turned to another page. We got caught in the rain after dinner. He refused to let me walk home and carried me the last 100 yards, even though his shoes were completely ruined. I read another page. Vincent canceled a meeting to spend the day with me. He said there will always be more business, but there is only one Evelyn. My vision blurred. I closed my eyes. Not because those memories were painful, but because they were beautiful. And beautiful things can hurt when they feel far away. I turned more pages. The handwriting gradually changed. The letters became tighter, the entries shorter. Less joy, more waiting. June 12th. Vincent promised we would spend the weekend together. Emergency meeting canceled it. September 3rd. Anniversary dinner postponed again. He said he'd make it up to me. December 18th. Fell asleep waiting for him. The food got cold. The candles burned out. He looked exhausted when he finally came home. I told him it was okay. I always told him it was okay. My chest tightened. The hardest part wasn't reading what happened. It was realizing how often I had excused it. Every disappointment had been wrapped inside understanding. Every lonely night had been hidden behind patience. I kept reading. Last year, February 21st. I miss him even when he's sitting in the same room. April 9th. I asked him if he wanted to take a trip together. He said maybe next month, October 14th. I can't remember the last conversation that lasted longer than 10 minutes. I pressed my fingers against my lips. The room felt impossibly quiet. Then I reached the most recent entry, only 3 weeks old. The ink still looked fresh. I remember writing it late at night while Vincent worked downstairs. I read every word slowly. I don't need grand gestures. I don't need expensive gifts. I don't need the man he was 10 years ago. I only need the man he is today to let me stand beside him. The sentence hit me harder than anything else because it was true. It had always been true. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I quickly closed the journal. One of the house staff stood outside the door. Mrs. Romano, dinner is ready. I glanced toward the clock. It was nearly 8 o'clock. Thank you, I said. Will Mr. Romano be joining me? The woman hesitated just long enough to answer before she spoke. No, ma'am, Mr. Romano called. He said he'll be working late again. The door closed quietly behind her. I looked down at the journal still resting in my hands. Then I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. For nearly 2 years, every single entry ended with hope. Everyone except the last. The next morning arrived brighter than the days before. Sunlight spilled across Lake Co, turning the water into liquid gold beneath a cloudless sky. It should have been beautiful. It should have lifted something inside me. Instead, I stood at the bedroom window watching the boats drift across the lake and felt strangely empty. Then I noticed the date on the calendar beside my desk. October 22nd, our wedding anniversary. For a moment, I simply stared at the number. 10 years. 10 years since Vincent and I had stood beneath white roses and promised forever. 10 years since he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. I closed my eyes and remembered that day with painful clarity. The sunlight, the music, the way his hands trembled when he slipped the ring onto my finger. Back then, neither of us knew what life would become. We only knew we wanted to face it together. A knock sounded at the door. One of the staff entered, carrying fresh flowers. White roses. My favorite. These arrived this morning, Mrs. Romano. My heart lifted despite myself. I hated that it did. I hated how easily hope still found me. I walked over and unfolded the small card attached to the bouquet. Thank you for supporting the Romano Foundation Charity Gala. We look forward to seeing you next month. I stared at the printed message, not from Vincent, just another formal invitation. The small spark inside me faded almost instantly. By late afternoon, I found myself preparing anyway. Old habits were difficult to break. I chose a navy blue dress Vincent once said matched my eyes. I arranged candles on the terrace overlooking the lake. I even asked the chef to prepare the lemon risotto we had shared on our honeymoon. The villa looked beautiful by sunset. Warm lights glowed across the gardens. The water reflected shades of orange and pink. Everything was ready. All that remained was Vincent. 6 o'clock passed, then 7. Then 8. My phone remained silent. I told myself he was busy. 9 o'clock arrived. The risotto cooled. The candles burned lower. I checked my phone again. Nothing. Outside, the last traces of sunlight disappeared beyond the mountains. The lake became dark and still. By 10 o'clock, I had stopped pretending to eat. I sat alone at the table, listening to the distant sound of water against the dock below. Every few minutes, I glanced toward the villa entrance. Every few minutes, I felt foolish for doing it. At 11:30, headlights finally appeared along the private road leading to the estate. My pulse jumped before I could stop it. The front doors opened. Footsteps echoed through the marble hallway. Vincent entered the terrace moments later, loosening his tie as he walked. He looked exhausted, older somehow. For a brief second, his eyes met mine. Confusion crossed his face. Then he noticed the candles, the dinner, the untouched wine glasses. The realization hit him visibly. Evelyn, he said quietly. I waited. He looked down at the date glowing on the screen of his phone. His expression changed. Regret, genuine regret. I forgot. 3 words. That was all. Not an excuse, not a reason. Just the truth. I looked at him for several seconds. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because suddenly I felt too tired to cry. I know, I said softly. Vincent took a step toward me. I stood before he could say anything else. The candles flickered in the evening breeze between us. Happy anniversary, Vincent. Then I walked past him and back into the villa, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't follow. The morning after our anniversary felt strangely peaceful. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows, painting soft patterns across the hardwood floor. For the first time in months, I woke before the alarm and simply listened. The villa was quiet. No phone calls, no footsteps in the hallway, no distant voices drifting up from Vincent's office. Just silence, real silence. I sat up slowly and looked around the room that had been my home for 10 years. The framed photographs on the dresser, the books stacked beside the bed, the cream-colored blanket folded neatly across the chair in the corner. Everything looked exactly the same, and somehow nothing felt the same at all. I reached for the journal on my nightstand and opened it to a blank page. The pen hovered above the paper for several seconds before the words finally came. I'm tired. Not angry, not bitter, just tired. I stared at the sentence. It was the most honest thing I had written in years. For so long, I had been trying to save something, trying to hold together every crack before it became visible, trying to convince myself that patience was enough. But love was never supposed to feel like carrying a house by yourself. By noon, I found myself walking through Villa Belladonna one room at a time. The library, the terrace, the rose garden, the dock overlooking the lake. Every place held a memory. Every memory felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. I stopped at the small chapel near the Eastern Gardens, where Vincent and I used to light candles together on important days. The candle holders were empty now. Dust gathered along the edges of the stone shelf. I couldn't remember the last time we had come here together. Back inside the villa, I opened the closet and pulled out a suitcase. The sound of the zipper echoed louder than it should have. I folded sweaters, jeans, and a few dresses. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, just enough for a while. Every item felt lighter than the decision itself. Hours passed. The sun drifted lower over the lake. By evening, the suitcase stood beside the door. I sat at my desk with a sheet of stationery in front of me. I rewrote the letter 3 times. The first version sounded too sad. The second sounded too angry. The third sounded like the truth. Dear Vincent, if you are reading this, then I finally did something I should have done a long time ago. I stopped waiting. This isn't punishment. It isn't revenge. I'm not leaving because I stopped loving you. I'm leaving because I do. Somewhere along the way, we became strangers living inside beautiful memories. I kept reaching for your hand. You kept reaching for tomorrow. Eventually, tomorrow became years. I need time to remember who I am when I'm not waiting for someone to come home. Love, Evelyn. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on his side of the bed. Then I removed my wedding ring and set it on top. The villa was dark when I left. The lake reflected 1,000 stars across the water. I paused at the front entrance and looked back one final time. The house stood exactly as it always had. Grand, beautiful, silent. Then I closed the door behind me. The next morning, Vincent Romano walked into our bedroom and discovered that for the first time in 10 years, Evelyn Carter Romano was gone. Vincent didn't understand what he was looking at first. The bedroom seemed normal when he walked in that morning. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. The fireplace had long gone cold. The scent of Evelyn's lavender perfume still lingered faintly in the air. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. Then his eyes landed on the empty side of the closet. He stopped. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Not fear, not yet. Confusion. He crossed the room slowly. The drawers were half empty. Several dresses were gone. Her favorite blue sweater was missing from the chair. The travel bag she usually used for weekend trips had disappeared. Evelyn, he called out instinctively. Silence answered him. He checked the bathroom. Empty the terrace. Empty the rose garden below. Empty. By the time he returned to the bedroom, something colder had begun to form inside him. That was when he saw the envelope resting on his pillow. His name was written across the front in Evelyn's familiar handwriting. Vincent stared at it for several seconds before picking it up. Then he noticed the ring sitting on top. His wedding ring remained on his own hand. Hers did not. For the first time in years, his pulse became uneven. He sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the letter. As he read, the room seemed to grow quieter with every line. By the end, he was staring at the page without moving. He read it again, then a third time. The words never changed. I stopped waiting. The sentence echoed louder than everything else. He looked around the bedroom. Suddenly, he noticed details he had ignored for months. The book on her nightstand. The reading glasses folded neatly beside it. The blanket she always wrapped around herself while reading by the fireplace. Evidence of a life that had existed beside his own while he remained too busy to truly see it. A knock sounded at the door. Matteo stepped inside. One look at Vincent's face and his expression changed. What happened? He asked. Vincent handed him the letter. Matteo read silently. The room remained still. Finally, he folded the paper and placed it carefully on the dresser. She left. Vincent nodded once. The words felt unreal. Matteo studied him for a long moment. Did you really not see this coming? Vincent looked away. The answer should have been yes. Any reasonable person would have seen it. Yet somehow he had convinced himself that Evelyn would always be there, always waiting, always understanding. The realization made him feel sick. I thought she was unhappy with who I became, Vincent admitted quietly. Matteo laughed without humor. No, she was unhappy because you stopped showing up. The words landed harder than Vincent expected. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Then Vincent stood abruptly and crossed the room toward Evelyn's desk. Something caught his attention. A stack of journals, more than a dozen of them arranged neatly along the shelf. Matteo noticed them too. "What are those?" he asked. Vincent picked up the nearest one and opened it. The first page was dated nearly 10 years earlier. He read a single paragraph, then another, then another. The room disappeared around him. Hours passed unnoticed. Meeting reminders buzzed on his phone. Assistants called. Business partners left messages. Vincent ignored all of them. He sat alone reading page after page of Evelyn's heart. Every hope, every disappointment, every lonely evening she never complained about. Every anniversary she celebrated by herself. Every promise she believed he would eventually keep. By sunset, he reached the final entry. "I don't need the man he used to be. I only need the man he is today to let me stand beside him." Vincent closed the journal slowly. His hands were shaking, not because Evelyn had left, but because for the first time he understood why. The first week after Evelyn left was the longest week of Vincent Romano's life. Not because time moved slower, but because, for the first time in years, he noticed every empty space she had once filled. Her favorite chair in the library remained untouched. The garden bench overlooking the lake sat vacant every morning. Even the kitchen felt different. The staff still prepared breakfast, but nobody asked for fresh strawberries anymore. Nobody hummed softly while watering the herbs on the terrace. The villa hadn't changed, yet somehow it felt abandoned. Vincent read all 13 journals, every page, every sentence, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning. He learned things he should have known years ago. He learned Evelyn had canceled vacations because his schedule changed. He learned she had quietly donated to local schools because she remembered children by name. He learned she still kept movie ticket stubs from their first dates inside a small wooden box. Most of all, he learned how often she chose understanding when she had every right to choose anger. By the 8th day, he could no longer sit inside Villa Belladonna pretending she'd eventually walk through the front door. He began searching, not the way Vincent Romano usually solved problems. There were no assistants organizing reports, no teams gathering information, no pressure, no demands. Just one husband trying to find the woman he loved. He started with places that mattered to her. A small bookstore in Milan where they used to spend rainy afternoons. A lakeside cafe in Bellagio where they had celebrated their first wedding anniversary. A flower market in Como where Evelyn once spent an hour choosing a single white rose because she said perfection couldn't be rushed. Each place carried memories. None carried answers. Days turned into weeks. October became November. The weather grew colder. Leaves drifted across empty sidewalks and collected along the lake shore. Vincent continued searching. Sometimes he would arrive somewhere and realize he wasn't really looking for Evelyn. He was looking for pieces of himself that existed only when she was beside him. One afternoon, he sat alone on a ferry crossing Lake Co. Gray clouds hung low over the water. Passengers wrapped themselves in scarves against the wind. Vincent pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. One page from Evelyn's journal. He had read it so many times the edges were beginning to wear thin. The entry was dated 4 years earlier. "We visited a tiny church by the water today. Nobody else was there." Vincent lit a candle and made a wish. He refused to tell me what it was. "I think some places hold pieces of our hearts forever." Vincent stared at the words. A memory surfaced immediately. A small church, stone walls, a view of the lake. Evelyn smiling as sunlight poured through stained glass windows. He hadn't thought about that day in years. Yet she had remembered every detail. His pulse quickened. The ferry docked 20 minutes later. For the first time since Evelyn left, Vincent felt something other than regret. Hope. Not certainty, not confidence, just hope. And sometimes hope was enough to make a man keep going. The church looked exactly as Evelyn had described it. Small, quiet, timeless. It sat on a narrow stretch of shoreline nearly hidden by cypress trees. Its weathered stone walls glowing softly beneath the late afternoon sun. Vincent parked his car at the bottom of the hill and stood there for a moment, staring at the familiar wooden doors. His heart was beating harder than it had during any business negotiation of his life. Not because he was afraid of finding Evelyn, but because he was afraid of finding out he was too late. He stepped inside. The scent of old wood and candle wax filled the air. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting patches of blue and gold across the stone floor. For several seconds, he saw no one. Then he noticed a figure sitting quietly in the third pew, Evelyn. Her light brown hair rested against the collar of her coat. A book lay open in her lap. She looked peaceful. Not happy, not sad, simply peaceful. Vincent felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. He had spent weeks searching for her. Yet seeing her now made him realize how much he had truly lost. Evelyn looked up at the sound of his footsteps. Surprise flashed across her face. Then calm returned. She closed the book slowly. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they had failed to say for years. Finally, Vincent sat down one pew behind her. Not beside her. Not yet. "I remembered this place from your journal," he said quietly. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "I wondered if you ever read them." The honesty of the answer made him wince. "I should have read them years ago." A faint smile appeared on her lips, but it carried no joy. "Yes, you should have." The truth hung between them, sharp but necessary. Vincent nodded. He didn't defend himself. For the first time, he understood that explanations wouldn't heal what neglect had damaged. Minutes passed. Outside, waves lapped gently against the shoreline. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. "Why here?" Vincent finally asked. Evelyn looked toward the stained glass window above the altar, sunlight reflected in her eyes. "Because this was one of the last places I felt truly seen." The words hurt more than anger ever could. Vincent swallowed hard. "I thought you left because you were unhappy with who I became." Evelyn looked at him, really looked at him. There was sadness in her expression, but not resentment. "Vincent, I never wanted the man you used to be." He froze. The sentence echoed through the church. "Then why did you leave?" Her answer came softly. "Because I spent years trying to stand beside you while you kept moving farther away." She folded her hands together. "I wasn't competing with your work. I was competing with your attention. And eventually, I became too tired to keep losing." Vincent stared at the floor. Every journal entry, every missed anniversary, every lonely dinner returned at once. Evelyn shook her head gently. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you." Her voice trembled slightly. "I left because loving you was no longer enough to keep me from disappearing." And for the first time since she walked away, Vincent realized the most painful truth of all. Evelyn had never abandoned their marriage. She had been trying to save it, long after he stopped noticing it needed saving. Neither of them moved for a long time after that. The church remained quiet around them, filled only with soft light and the distant sound of water against the shore. Vincent sat there staring at his hands, feeling the weight of everything he had almost lost. For years, he had measured success in numbers, responsibilities, and obligations. He had convinced himself that providing a beautiful life was the same thing as being present inside it. Now he understood the difference. Evelyn wasn't asking for perfection. She never had. She was asking for partnership. She was asking to be seen. Slowly, Vincent stood and walked forward. This time he sat beside her. Not because he expected forgiveness. Not because he believed one conversation could repair years of distance. He sat beside her because it was where he should have been all along. Evelyn looked out toward the stained glass windows. Her expression remained calm, but he could see the exhaustion behind it. The exhaustion of someone who had carried hope for too long. "I can't change the last 10 years, Vincent said quietly. "I wish I could." Evelyn nodded. "I know." He swallowed hard. "I thought love meant protecting everything around you." A sad smile touched her lips. Sometimes love means showing up. The truth of it settled between them. Simple, unavoidable. Vincent looked toward the altar, then back at her. "I don't want you to come back because of history." Evelyn remained silent. "I don't want you to come back because of promises we made 10 years ago." Her eyes finally met his. "Then what do you want?" For the first time in a very long time, Vincent answered without rehearsing the words, without hiding behind certainty. "Tell me who you are today." Evelyn blinked. He continued softly. "Not who you were when we met. Not who you were when we got married. Not who you were in those journals." His voice shook slightly. "Tell me who you are now, because I want to know her. I want to understand her, and I want the chance to fall in love with her too." Tears gathered in Evelyn's eyes. Not dramatic tears, just quiet ones. The kind that arrive when someone finally hears the thing they have waited years to hear. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds and spilled across the lake. The colored glass transformed the church floor into ribbons of golden blue. Neither of them rushed the moment. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic promise, no perfect ending waiting around the corner. There was only truth. For the first time in years, they were speaking honestly. For the first time in years, they were standing in the same place emotionally, instead of reaching for each other across a widening distance. An hour later, they left the church together and walked slowly along the shoreline. Not as strangers, not quite as the couple they used to be. Something new, something fragile, something real. As the sun lowered across Lake Co., Vincent noticed Evelyn smiling at something small for the first time in months. He smiled too. Maybe love wasn't about finding your way back to the past. Maybe it was about having the courage to meet each other again in the present. And sometimes a marriage doesn't need a second chance. It simply needs two people willing to choose each other one more time.